there is a moment, and if you have ever been awake at the wrong hour of the night, you know exactly the one I mean, where the world around you goes completely, unnervingly still. The traffic disappears, the neighbors go quiet, even the wind seems to decide it is somewhere better to be, and you're left sitting in whatever room you are in, listening to the kind of silence that makes you start to wonder whether you actually are as alone as you think you are. Most of the time, you are. Most of the time, that silence means nothing at all. It is just the world resting, the city breathing out, the ordinary machinery of a quiet night doing what quiet nights do. But sometimes, and this is what tonight is about, and sometimes that silence is the thing that comes right before you find out that something has been very, very wrong for a very, very long time. Not minutes, not hours, weeks, in some cases months, long enough that whoever or whatever was responsible had grown comfortable, had settled in, had stopped worrying about being caught because they had learned through patient observation that no one was looking. Tonight we have 3 stories, 3 real accounts from 3 ordinary people who were all, in one way or another, caught off guard by the dark. A hotel night auditor who noticed something impossible happening to an elevator on a sealed floor, and then made the mistake of going to investigate alone. A man who worked the overnight shift stocking shelves at a grocery store and began to suspect, gradually and then all at once, that he had never once been alone in that building, and a man on a solo road trip who stopped for the night at a small motel in Northern California and started noticing, lying in the dark of his room, that whatever he did inside those 4 walls, whoever was in the room right next door already seemed to know about it. I want you to stay with me tonight, because every single one of these stories gets worse before it ends. Welcome back to Silent Fear. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we put out new content every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Once you are settled in, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I always love seeing where the Silent Fear family is tuning in from. Whether you are in a crowded apartment building with neighbors on the other side of every wall, or somewhere considerably more remote where the nearest other person is farther away than you would like to think about right now. Either way, it is good to know you are out there. Let us get into it. The first story comes from a man named Daniel from the state of Texas. And I want to begin with Daniel by telling you something he said himself right at the start of his submission, because it matters for understanding how what happened to him landed the way it did. He said, and I am paraphrasing, that before any of this happened, he genuinely believed he was the kind of person nothing could rattle. He had worked the overnight front desk shift at a mid-sized hotel for almost 3 years. He had seen drunken guests and screaming couples mid-argument. He had watched a man attempt to check in carrying a live chicken under one arm, as casually as if it were a briefcase. He had sat across a front desk from a woman who informed him, in complete seriousness and without any apparent irony, that she was being followed by the moon. Daniel had smiled at that woman, handed her a key card, and gone straight back to his crossword puzzle without so much as blinking. So when Daniel tells you that what happened at that hotel shook him in a way that nothing before or since has come close to matching, I think that is worth letting sit for a moment before we get into what actually occurred. The hotel had 7 floors. Floors 1 through 5 were fully operational, sir. Guest rooms, housekeeping carts in the corridors, the usual business of a working hotel. Floor 7 was the executive level. Small, exclusive, rarely booked to capacity. And floor 6 had been completely closed off for roughly 18 months before Daniel started his job there. A burst pipe had caused significant water damage to several rooms and part of the corridor ceiling. Management had sealed the floor while a prolonged insurance dispute worked itself out. And aside from the occasional maintenance contractor who came through during daylight hours to assess ongoing repairs, nobody went up there. There was nothing up there worth going to. The elevator did not even stop there anymore. The facilities team had the 6th floor button disabled on the control panel inside the car. You could press it all you wanted. Nothing would happen. The doors would not open. The car would not move toward it. As far as the elevator was concerned, floor 6 simply did not exist. Daniel worked his shift alone at the front desk from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. It was a quiet job most nights, answering the occasional late call from a guest who needed extra towels or could not figure out the thermostat, processing checkouts for early departures, watching the monitors. Above his desk, there was a bank of small security screens, each one showing a different camera feed from around the property. One of those screens showed the interior of the elevator at all times. On a Tuesday night at precisely 2:47 in the morning, Daniel looked up from whatever he was doing and watched the elevator doors open on the 6th floor. The camera inside the car showed an empty elevator. Nobody had pressed the button from inside. Nobody had called it from the hallway. It had traveled entirely on its own to a floor it was programmed not to stop at, and it had opened its doors onto a dark and sealed hallway, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Daniel's first reaction was not fear, it was confusion, and then the mild irritation of someone who's been given an unexpected problem to deal with at nearly 3 in the morning. Old elevators, he reasoned, did strange things. Wiring degraded, relays stuck. He wrote it in the incident log, flagged it for the morning manager, and went back to his shift. It happened again the following night, 2:49 in the morning. The night after that, 2:51. Now I want you to pause on that for a moment, because this is the detail that took the whole thing from strange to something else entirely. It was not simply that the elevator was traveling to a floor it was not supposed to reach. It was that it was doing so on an advancing schedule, 2 minutes later each consecutive night, like a timer counting up, like something that had all the time in the world and was in absolutely no hurry at all. By night 4, Daniel had stopped calling it a glitch. He reported it to the building manager, who told him he would get a technician in to look at it. The technician came, ran a complete diagnostic of the elevator system, found nothing mechanically or electrically wrong, charged the hotel $400, and left. The elevator continued opening on the 6th floor every single night, 2 minutes later each time, unhurried, completely without explanation. On night 8, Daniel made a decision he is the first to admit was not his wisest. He took the stairwell up to the 6th floor to look for himself. He brought his radio. He propped the stairwell door open with his shoe, so there was a clear and unobstructed path back down if he needed one quickly. He told himself he was simply going to crack the hallway door, look down the corridor, confirm the floor was empty, and return to the desk. That was the entirety of the plan. The floor was dark. Emergency lighting only. That flat, reddish-orange glow that drains color from everything and makes familiar shapes look like something other than what they are. The smell reached him before he had even properly stepped through the door. Old damp, the particular staleness of dried plaster and stale air, sealed inside a space for a long time, and underneath it something else he could not quite name. Most of the guest room doors along the corridor were closed. A few stood open onto dark interiors that his eyes could not reach the back of, and running straight down the center of the hallway, clearly visible even in that low emergency light, were footprints. In the plaster dust that had settled across the floor over 18 months of disuse, there were footprints. Not one set, multiple sets. Overlapping tracks that had worn the dust away entirely in places, leaving what could only be described as a path. The kind of path you wear into a surface through repeated use over a long period of time. The tracks went from the elevator doors down the length of the hallway to the far end and back again, back and forth, over and over, to and from a room at the very end of the corridor. Room 614. Daniel did not go to room 614. He went back downstairs. He sat at the front desk with the stairwell monitor and the elevator feed both pulled up in front of him, and he watched them for the rest of his shift without moving very much. When he arrived for his next shift, he opened the key card drawer behind the desk as part of his standard start of shift check. Inside it was a key card he had never seen before and had certainly not placed there himself. He held it near the reader on the desk. The light blinked green. It was programmed and fully active. He checked the encoding. The card was keyed to room 614. The overnight security log showed no key card generated for that room. The day shift manager had no idea where the card had come from. The property management system showed no record of the card being created at any point in the past 18 months. Someone had come to the front desk during a staffed shift, during business hours, in a working hotel with guests and staff moving through the lobby, and placed that card in the drawer. Someone who not only had access to a sealed room, but had a working key card for it, and who was comfortable enough moving through that building to walk up to the front desk unnoticed and leave something there. Daniel called the assistant general manager at home. She came in, looked at the card, reviewed the elevator logs Daniel had been keeping, and walked the lobby slowly with her arms folded and her jaw tight. Then she told him she was escalating it to the corporate security team. Told Daniel not to go to the 6th floor alone under any circumstances, and left. At 2:59 in the morning, the elevator opened on the 6th floor. Daniel called the on-duty security guard on his radio and told him to meet him at the stairwell door. The two of them went up together. The door to room 614 was open. Inside the room, in the darkness, positioned dead center in the open doorway and facing directly outward into the hallway, was a chair. A single chair, angled with total deliberateness. There was no other interpretation for how it was placed. Whoever had put it there to sit and watch, to watch the hallway, to see anything that moved in either direction along that sealed corridor. On the floor beside the chair was an empty protein bar wrapper, the kind available at any petrol station or convenience store anywhere in the country. And on the small table near the window, mounted on a compact tripod and pointed downward at the hotel car park below, was a trail camera of the type used by hunters and wildlife researchers. Small, unobtrusive, a device designed specifically to record without being noticed. When security pulled the memory card from that camera, They found more than 3 weeks of photographs on it. Every one of them time-stamped. Every one of them showing the car park from above. Vehicles arriving and departing. Guests being dropped off. Staff pulling in at the start of their shifts. Dozens and dozens of photographs of Daniel specifically, walking from his car to the staff entrance. Night after night. The same angle, the same subject, documented over and over across more than 3 weeks by someone who had been sitting in that chair in the sealed dark 1 floor directly above the front desk and watching him arrive at work every single night he came in. The police found no one. A full search of the building and grounds came back empty. The camera, the chair, and the food packaging were taken as evidence. Daniel transferred to a different hotel within the month, and to his knowledge, whoever had been living quietly on that closed floor above him was never found and never identified. He said the thing that stays with him the most is not the camera or the photographs of himself or even the chair. It is the footprints, the worn, overlapping paths in the plaster dust. The way they showed, without any ambiguity, just how many nights someone had paced that same stretch of sealed hallway in the dark. Back and forth, completely unhurried and completely unbothered, while he sat 1 floor below them and believed entirely that he was alone in the building. The second story tonight comes from a man named James, from the state of Ohio. And James's story is, in certain ways, the most slowly built of the 3 we have tonight. It does not begin with anything dramatic or immediately alarming. It begins with a pair of shoes at the end of an aisle. James worked the overnight stocking shift at a large grocery store for close to 2 years, midnight to 8 in the morning, 5 nights a week. He said in his submission that for the overwhelming majority of that time, he actually enjoyed the work. There is a rhythm to stocking shelves in an empty store at 3 in the morning, he said, a kind of meditative repetition that becomes almost peaceful once you stop fighting it. The hum of the refrigeration units running the length of the back wall, the rumble of the stock cart wheels on tile, whatever was playing through his earphones. He knew his section well enough that his hands could do the work, while his mind went elsewhere entirely. There were usually 4 or 5 people on the overnight crew alongside him. But the store was large, and each person worked their own section, and it was entirely normal to go 45 minutes or more without physically crossing paths with another coworker. That was not unusual. That was just how the shift operated. James worked dry goods, cereals, pasta, baking supplies. That long central corridor of shelving that runs through the middle of most large grocery stores. Same aisle, same section, every single night. He knew every shelf height, every facing, every product. He would have noticed instantly if something was out of place. On a Wednesday night in October, a night he describes in his submission as being completely and boringly unremarkable, right up until it was not, he was making his way down the aisle when he noticed something at the far end of the section, just visible past the edge of the end cap display. A pair of shoes, dark sneakers, toes pointing in his direction. Just the feet. Nothing above ankle height was visible from where he stood, blocked by the base of the shelving unit. Not moving, just there. He assumed it was Michael, one of the other overnight stalkers, taking a breather at the end of the aisle. He called out Michael's name. No answer came back. He walked the length of the aisle, turned the corner of the end cap display, and there was nobody there. The space at the end of the aisle was empty. He found Michael 2 aisles over in the paper goods section, his arms deep inside a case of paper towels. Michael said he hadn't been anywhere near the dry goods aisle. James wrote the moment off without much thought. One odd thing, easy enough to set aside. He finished his shift and drove home and did not think about it again until the same shoes appeared at the end of the same aisle 4 nights later. Same position, same time, between 2:15 and 2:30 in the morning. He noticed it again 3 nights after that. He began timing it deliberately after the 3rd occurrence. He started working with part of his attention held back, checking the far end of the aisle at intervals, watching for it. And the pattern did not break. Every single shift, somewhere between 2:15 and 2:30, the shoes would appear, visible only as feet passed the bottom of the shelving unit, facing his direction, unmoving. And by the time he walked close enough to see anything above ankle height, there was no one there. He reported it to the shift supervisor. The supervisor walked the store with him, checked the back storage rooms, the bathrooms, the receiving dock. Nothing. He suggested it was probably the night security guard running extra passes through the section. James asked the security guard directly. The guard said his rounds didn't take him through dry goods. The supervisor told James he would keep an eye on it and went back to his own section. James went back to his aisle. Then one night, the shoes did not appear, and the following night he found the note. It was folded in half and placed between 2 boxes of instant oatmeal on a shelf he had personally restocked less than an hour before. A single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting on it was small and very neat. There were 3 sentences. You always start at the pasta end. You take your first break at 2. You eat the same thing every night. James said that when he read those 3 lines, his first reaction was a kind of suspended electric disbelief. The kind where your brain refuses for a moment to process what your eyes are telling it. He read the note 3 times before his hands began to shake. And they did not shake because the sentences were threatening in any obvious or direct way. They shook because every word was correct. The pasta end was exactly where he started, without exception, every single shift. His break was always at 2. The food he brought to eat was the same thing every night, a habit he had fallen into months ago and maintained automatically without ever really thinking about it. Whoever had left that note had not guessed. They had not stumbled onto a pattern by accident. They had watched him deliberately, systematically, and over enough time to confirm that these behaviors were consistent. They had cataloged him. And by leaving the note where he would find it, in a shelf he had stocked himself less than an hour earlier, they were making sure he knew it. The supervisor called the store manager at home. The store manager called the security company. By 3 in the morning, there were 2 additional security personnel moving through the building while the remaining staff finished out the shift in pairs. No one working their section alone. The entire store was searched from front to back. No person was found. No sign of forced entry. No explanation for how anyone could be entering and exiting during a staffed overnight shift without triggering the alarm system. Then one of the security guards found the back receiving door, unlocked, not forced, not damaged in any way, simply unlocked from the inside. Someone had, before leaving, reached back and manually disengaged the deadbolt. The alarm system was designed to trigger only if the door was opened from the exterior without a code. Someone pushing it open from inside and walking out would set off nothing at all, which meant whoever had been in that store had been letting themselves out through that door. And if they had been letting themselves out that way, they had almost certainly been letting themselves back in the same way, which in turn meant they had likely been inside the building before closing, concealing themselves somewhere while the store shut down for the night, and then emerging when the overnight crew arrived, and the building became active again around them. The police estimated, based on the precision of the note and on a finding that turned James's stomach when he heard it, a faint groove worn into the linoleum floor at the far end of his aisle, a shallow but unmistakable depression in the tile that could only develop through sustained, repeated standing in the exact same spot, that whoever had been doing this had been returning consistently for somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks. 6 to 10 weeks of standing at the end of his aisle, watching him work his way down the shelves, learning the architecture of his routine, writing it down. James did not go back to that job. He said in his submission that the note still surfaces in his mind sometimes, even years after the fact. The last line specifically, "You eat the same thing every night," because James always ate his break meal in the back staff break room with the door closed at the small table in the corner, which means that at some point on some night among all those weeks of nights, whoever had been watching him had been close enough to see through that closed door, close enough to observe what he was eating in a room where he believed he had complete privacy. He does not know which night that was. He does not know how many times it happened. He does not know what else was observed in moments he believed were entirely his own. And he said with a quietness that came through even in a written submission that he decided a long time ago he was probably better off not knowing the answers to any of those questions. The third and final story tonight comes from a man named Andrew from the state of Oregon. Andrew was 26 years old when the events he describes took place. He had recently come out of a long relationship, and by his own admission, with a self-awareness that comes across clearly in his submission, he was in a period of his life where he had convinced himself that driving alone for extended distances was a productive and meaningful way to process emotional pain. He is the first to acknowledge, looking back, that this belief was mostly optimistic nonsense, and that long solo drives are largely just long. But he went on one of those trips regardless, heading south along the California coast, with no fixed destination and no particular plan, stopping wherever seemed worth stopping and moving on the next day. On the third night of the drive, with the light long gone from the sky and his concentration beginning to fray at the edges, he pulled off the highway into a small town in Northern California and checked into a motel. He said in his account that the place looked exactly like the word motel summons in the imagination. A single-story building with an exterior walkway running the full length of the ground floor. Numbered doors, all facing the car park. A vending machine next to the ice maker with approximately half of its buttons in working order. He booked the last available room from a night manager behind the front desk, who acknowledged his presence without ever fully taking his eyes off the television mounted on the wall behind him. Andrew got his key, walked the corridor, and let himself into room 11. Room 12 was immediately next door. There was light showing under the door. Andrew noted this but did not think much of it at the time. Before heading to his room, he had made small talk with the manager, asking how busy the place was. The manager had said there were 3 guests in the building, 1 in room 4, 1 in room 8. He had not mentioned room 12. Andrew assumed the manager had simply lost track, or that a guest had checked in after the last time he had mentally tallied the count. It did not feel like anything that required further thought. He went inside, dropped his bag on the bed, and turned on the television. He flipped through the available channels until he found a home improvement program, the kind of low-stakes background noise that is well suited to falling asleep to, and left it running while he got ready for bed. He washed his face, checked his phone, set an alarm. He was reaching for the remote to switch the TV off when something made him stop. Through the shared wall between his room and room 12, faint but clear enough to identify, he could hear the same program playing, the same voices, the same segment, and not just the same channel, the same moment. The audio from room 12 was in sync with his own television to a degree that went beyond coincidence. Andrew told himself the same thing any reasonable person would try to tell themselves in that moment. Old motels with aging infrastructure sometimes had strange quirks in how their electrical systems behaved. Maybe the televisions were drawing from a shared signal source somewhere in the building. Maybe the previous occupant of room 12 had left the TV on a particular channel, and something in the wiring had caused it to mirror whatever channel was being watched next door. He had heard of stranger things. He changed his channel to a news broadcast. He watched the screen. Then, from the other side of the wall, the same news anchor's voice began in room 12. Same program, same story, same point in the sentence. His mouth went dry. He changed the channel again, this time to a loud and garish infomercial. He counted the seconds. At 5 seconds, word for word, the same infomercial started up through the wall. Andrew sat on the edge of the bed and turned his television off. He sat in the silence and listened to the room next door. Within 30 seconds, the TV in room 12 went silent as well. He stayed very still for what he describes as a long moment. And then, he is genuinely uncertain even now why he did this. Whether it was some impulse to test the limits of what was happening, or simply a reflex that bypassed his better judgment entirely. He reached out and knocked twice on the wall. Not forcefully. 2 quiet, brief raps. The kind of knock you might use to let a neighbor know you can hear them through the wall. After a pause of approximately 4 seconds, 2 knocks came back from the other side. Andrew did not knock again. He pulled back onto the bed, put his back against the headboard, and sat there in the dark without moving for a considerable amount of time. He does not know how long. Long enough that exhaustion eventually won out over fear. Because at some point he must have drifted off. Because the next thing he was aware of was the lamp still burning beside the bed and the digital clock on the nightstand reading 3:22 in the morning. And as he came back to full alertness and remembered where he was and why the lamp was on, he became aware of a sound he could not immediately place. It was coming from the base of his door. Not a knock, not a voice. Just the very faint sound of paper moving against carpet, slow and deliberate. The sound of something being slid carefully through the gap beneath the door. Andrew lay still and listened to that sound until it stopped. Then he lay still a while longer and listened to the corridor outside. Then he got up, crossed the room, and looked at the floor. Just inside the door was a Polaroid photograph. He picked it up. It was a photograph of him asleep in the bed he had just been asleep in. It had been taken from outside the window, through the gap, where the curtain had not quite closed, all the way across the frame. Whoever took it had been standing in the car park in the dark of the very early morning, outside his window, looking in at him while he slept, and had taken the photograph with a Polaroid camera. The timestamp printed in the corner of the photograph read 1:44 in the morning. Andrew called the front desk. The night manager picked up on the fourth ring, his voice thick with interrupted sleep. Andrew told him, in as level a voice as he could manage, that a photograph had just been slid under his door, that the photograph had been taken through his window while he was asleep, that he needed to know immediately who was in room 12. The manager put him on hold. The silence on the line stretched out long enough that Andrew started to wonder if he had simply been left there and forgotten. Then the manager came back, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The half-asleep quality was gone. In its place was a careful, measured caution. He said room 12 had been taken out of service around 6 months ago following an electrical fault. It had not had an occupant since the previous May. He repeated it when Andrew asked him to say it again. Room 12 was empty, had been empty for 6 months. Andrew told him to call the police. He wedged the desk chair under the door handle and didn't move from the bed until the patrol car arrived. The officers searched the exterior of the building and the car park. They checked the corridor. They opened room 12 and went through it. It was empty and dusty, the surfaces covered in the settled, undisturbed residue of a room that has not been entered in months. There was no sign of recent occupation. What they found outside was in the gravel of the car park, along the exterior wall directly beneath Andrew's window. Footprints, clearly defined. They came from the eastern edge of the property, tracked across the gravel to a point below his window, and stopped. The gravel in that stopping spot was compressed deeply enough that it was evident someone had stood there with their full weight for more than a brief moment. Then the prints continued back in the direction they had come from, and on the wall beside the window, just above the ledge where the paint met the stucco exterior, scratched lightly into the surface with something pointed, were marks. The officer found them because he was running his torch along the wall at a low horizontal angle, and the beam caught the raised edges of the scratches, where they broke the flat surface of the paint. Tally marks, made in the traditional groupings of 4 vertical lines, crossed by a 5th diagonal. The kind of marks kept by someone tracking a count methodically over time, intending to return to it. There were 19 of them. Andrew had checked into that motel for the first time that evening. The exterior security camera that covered the east side of the property had been spray painted over at some point during the evening before Andrew arrived. The footage from the remaining cameras showed nothing useful, no clear images of anyone moving along the east side of the building or approaching the window from that direction. Andrew gave his statement, moved to a different room for what remained of the night with a patrol car parked outside, and left as soon as the morning light made the drive feel manageable. He did not stop again for a long time. He said in his account that the tally marks are the thing that has never entirely left him. Not the photograph, not the knocking, not the mirrored television channels. The marks. 19 of them, scratched into the wall beside the window of a motel room that had been listed as out of service for 6 months. 19 visits at minimum to stand outside that window in the dark. 19 nights of watching whoever happened to be asleep on the other side of the glass. He does not know what the count meant. He does not know whether it tracked guests or nights or something else entirely. He does not know whether whoever made those marks came back after he left, whether the number became 20, whether it kept climbing past that. He chose not to seek out that information. He said it was a deliberate choice, made once and not revisited. There are things, he wrote, that you recognize you are better off not knowing, and that one was among them. He thinks it was probably the right call. 3 stories. 3 ordinary people in 3 completely different places, none of whom had any reason to suspect that anything was wrong until suddenly and irreversibly they did. A sealed floor with worn paths in the dust and a trail camera pointed at the car park below. A note tucked precisely into a shelf that had been freshly restocked less than an hour before. A Polaroid photograph of a sleeping man slipped under a motel door at 1:44 in the morning, with 19 tally marks scratched into the wall outside his window. None of what happened to Daniel or to James or to Andrew announced itself. None of it arrived with a warning. It crept in the way all genuinely unsettling things tend to creep in, through the edges, in moments small enough to dismiss and easy enough to explain. An elevator opening on a floor it should not reach. A pair of shoes at the far end of an otherwise empty aisle. A sound through a motel wall that feels wrong, but not quite wrong enough in the moment to act on. And at each of those early junctures, each of these 3 people did what most of us would do. They found a reasonable explanation. They told themselves it was nothing, or nearly nothing, or the kind of nothing that, resolves itself if you give it enough time. They went back to their night because that is what we do. That is the quiet bargain we make with ourselves in order to move through ordinary life without being crushed by the weight of every unexplained and unsettling thing we encounter. We rationalize, we dismiss, we file it under coincidence and carry on. Most of the time, that bargain serves us perfectly well. Most of the time, the strange thing really is nothing. The sound really is the building settling. The feeling of being watched really is just the particular anxiety that comes with being alone in a large and unfamiliar space after dark. But the trouble with that bargain, the fine print, so to speak, is that the things on the other side of it do not always deserve to be let off so easily. Sometimes the strange thing is not nothing. Sometimes the elevator really is going somewhere it should not go, for reasons that have nothing to do with faulty wiring. Sometimes the shoes at the end of the aisle belong to someone who's been coming back night after night and standing in the same spot in the dark, learning you. The part of these stories that stays with me longest is never the discovery moment, as dramatic as those moments are. It is not the chair facing the hallway or the worn groove pressed into linoleum by weeks of patient standing or the tally marks in the motel wall. What I keep returning to is the time before any of that was found. The days and the weeks during which everything that was eventually uncovered had already been there, already in motion, already settled into its routine, while the person at the center of it moved through their own routine completely unaware. Waving to coworkers, making coffee, driving home in the early morning believing the night had been ordinary. How many nights had someone already spent walking that sealed corridor before Daniel noticed the elevator moving? How many weeks before the groove worn into the floor of James's aisle reached the depth where it qualified as physical evidence of something? How many times had someone crossed that gravel car park and stood below Andrew's window, before the count scratched into the wall beside it reached 19? We do not know. In all 3 cases, we genuinely do not know, and we almost certainly never will. If any of what you heard tonight reminded you of something you saw, something you heard, something you have carried around without ever quite being able to explain it away, you can submit it through the link in the description below. We read every single submission, and if your story is featured on this channel, we will always change names and identifying details before it goes out. Your privacy is not negotiable. If you made it all the way to the end of tonight's video, do me one favor. Hit the like button and make sure you are subscribed to Silent Fear. We have something coming next week that I think is going to get underneath your skin in a way you are not expecting. I do not say that lightly. And before you go, drop a comment. Tell me which of the 3 stories tonight unsettled you the most. And tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. I read every single one of those comments, everyone. Stay safe out there. Keep the lights on if you need to. I will see you next week.